Humans have the awesome, really the uncanny, really, ability to experience what other people are experiencing. To, in some sense, really feel what you are feeling vicariously. So there's this famous series of experiments were done. It's Parma University, Italy, one of the oldest universities in the world. 1991. Some neuroscientists are studying these macaque monkeys, and they've got these electrodes in their brains, and they're trying to map their brains. So when you grab a raisin, what happens? They map the different motor functions. Each thing, when you do something, what buzzes in your brain. So you grab a raisin, bzz, you reach for a banana, bzz, you do this. Whatever you do, what happens? And then one day, as the story goes, one of the researchers came into the office to check something, and he was carrying an ice cream. Gelato. And he's sitting there, and he takes a lick, and he hears bzzz. It's like, what was that? And he looks over, and there's a macaque monkey just staring at him. Like, what's your problem? He takes another lick of his gelato, and bzzz. And each time he licks his gelato, something goes off in the monkey's brain. And this is the discovery of so-called mirror neurons. The theory is that we, like macaque monkeys, have neurons that allow our brains to mirror someone else's brain. The reason that I can feel what you're feeling is that literally while you're doing something in my brain is going off at the exact same time. When I see you do something, the same thing happens in my brain. And they've actually obviously measured this with monkeys, but no one's yet agreed to have electrodes put in their brain to test this in humans. There you go. So in some real sense, the theory goes, I can feel what you're feeling, and you can feel what I'm feeling. Now, unless you're a psychopath, you know what I'm talking about, right? If you see someone has something over their mouth and they're struggling to breathe, you struggle to breathe. If you see someone having a panic attack, what happens? You feel it. It feels like something heavy is pressing on your chest. You watch Jalen Hurts running through linebackers, and you're sitting on your couch. What are you doing? You're dodging the linebackers too, right? Your spouse gets sick, and you hear it in the bathroom, and what happens? You start to feel sick. Some of you are sympathetic criers. You could be walking down the street and see a complete stranger crying. You have no idea why they're crying, but suddenly it's so sad you have to cry too. What's wrong with you people? So this goes beyond mere sympathy. We can actually feel what others feel. In fact, we have the same physiological response in our body that they're having. Our brain mirrors their brain. This is curious indeed. And where this becomes, I think, just fascinating is in the field of interpersonal neurobiology. Interpersonal, between persons, not just within you, but between persons. Neurobiology, like the actual structure of your brain. An increasing number of neuroscientists and psychotherapists, guys like Dan Siegel, Jeff Hochschlaw, Kirk Thompson, argue that when we experience the feeling of being felt, that sense of we're feeling what that person is feeling, it changes your neurobiology. Really re-hardwires your brain. So when someone enters into your experience, when their brain activity mirrors when their body releases cortisol just like yours, when their shoulders let down or their stomach knots up, and just like you, when you feel that they feel what you feel, something happens. It changes your brain, literally reshapes your neural pathways. It changes how you remember things, the associations you make, how you interpret events. So the best, and maybe the worst, example of this is trauma. So some people will experience something horrific, abuse, accident, death, cancer, something horrible, and it will scar their brain. It actually reformats their brain so that over and over again they find themselves caught in this loop where they can't not think about that thing, and things will happen in their life. They're totally unassociated, but it'll trigger it, and they'll be back then in that state of trauma or PTSD. Others, though, they found, can experience the exact same thing and just have a really bad day, not be traumatized. And you know what the difference is? The difference, and I quote, between someone having a traumatic experience and someone just having a really bad day is the presence of an empathetic other. Someone feels it with you. Someone goes through that with you. You're not carrying it by yourself. Someone experiences what you're experiencing that changes the experience for you. That you and I need someone to enter into our experience in order to process how we think and feel about our own experiences. Or to put it negatively, if I never feel felt, if I never let anyone in to experience what's actually going on inside of me, it is unlikely that I will ever be able to escape what's actually going on inside of me. If I never let anyone into my thoughts and feelings, it will be likely that I will never be able to, I will be trapped in my own head, defined by what happened to me, imprisoned by my own anxious, fearful thoughts. So this feeling of being felt seems to be a pathway to like actually reformatting your brain, relieving shame, overcoming fear, seeing things differently, making sense of your own experiences in a way that you cannot, hear me, you cannot do on your own. You cannot do on your own. Someone else has to enter into that experience with you. And this, my friends, is terrifying. It's terrifying. This implies that unless I open up my deepest insecurities, fears, problems, brokenness, sins, whatever's wrong, unless I'm vulnerable about those things and invite someone else in to experience those things with me, well, then I will likely be trapped in them forever. And if you're like me, I'm not sure what sounds worse. Sharing my feelings or being trapped in them. So in his book, Telling Secrets, one of my favorite authors, Frederick Buechner, has this little gem for us. He writes this: what we hunger for, perhaps more than anything else, is to be known, to really be seen. And yet, that is often just what we also fear more than anything else. That. Now, if you're sitting there wondering, what does interpersonal neurobiology have to do with Easter? Maybe nothing. Isn't it curious though? But maybe something. So this is a question that I personally have for the Apostle John, because when we go to like Matthew, Mark, Luke, somewhat Luke, but Paul and Peter for sure, when we go to them and we ask them, tell us about the resurrection, tell us what this means for us, explain to us Easter, they are immediately going to go towards like something historical, like, more than 500 witnesses were there and saw the resurrected Lord, so it's a historical fact. Or they're going to go theological, and they're going to use words like eschatology and what's happening in the scope of all human history. Or they're going to go epic. There's going to be like earthquakes and people rising from the dead, that type of language. But John, he seems to not care about any of that. He seems to sidestep all of that. When we ask him to tell us about Easter and what it means for us, well, for John, it's personal. It's the story of Mary. The one who had 7 demons in her before she met Jesus, that one. She meets him in the garden, and she clings to him and doesn't want to let go. It's the story of Thomas, the guy who doubted Jesus publicly, didn't believe in him. And Jesus shows up, disrobes, and says, here, put your hand here, Thomas. It's the story of Peter, who denied Jesus, and then Jesus shows up later, fixes breakfast for the disciples, and across the fire, looking directly at Peter, says, do you love me? It is intimate, it is personal, it almost awkwardly so. When we ask John to describe, to explain, to make sense of the resurrection, he doesn't go towards the epic or the universal or towards theological or historical. For John, it's personal, deeply. And when we press John on this point, we ask, why do you always go this so personal route? Why do you make it about these individuals and their personal stories? And why do you want us to see Jesus meeting Mary in her shame and Thomas in his doubt and Peter in his denial? Why do you couple that with Easter morning? The only answer we seem to get to help explain this is John chapter 11. And John chapter 11 is not an Easter story. Not exactly. In John's language, this story is a sign. It points to something else. It helps make sense of something. It tells you the significance, the significance of something. So John chapter 11 is a story that is to help us make sense of the resurrection of Jesus, help make sense of Easter, and helps us see why John seems to think that the Easter story can only be captured in these deeply personal, interpersonal encounters with the resurrected Jesus. So, with that as the question, let's look at this chapter. John chapter 11, starting in verse 1. The story goes like this. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now we don't know much about this Lazarus. He's kind of overshadowed by his more famous sisters. There is a story in Luke chapter 16 where Jesus tells this story. Some think it's a parable about a poor man named Lazarus who gets sick and dies, and a wealthy man who was his master who dies. And Lazarus is at Abraham's bosom, this place of comfort, and the rich man goes to a place of torment. And the rich man says to Abraham, please send Lazarus back from the dead so he can warn my 5 brothers and they don't end up here. Some think that this is the same Lazarus. All we can say for sure from this text, though, is that this Lazarus is sick. And he's from Bethany, which in Hebrew is not accidental. It means the house of suffering. He lives in the house of suffering with his 2 sisters. And he's deeply loved by Jesus. He's not a person who's loved by Jesus. He's the one you love. Now, isn't this curious? Even if we don't read it anymore, we usually think of these 2 things as opposite. To be sick and in suffering, living in the house of suffering, we would usually think of that as opposite, as being loved by Jesus. But for John, these 2 go hand in hand. He's sick and suffering and deeply loved by Jesus, both. He's suffering deeply and loved deeply. But Jesus, if you love him, aren't you going to do something about it? When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. So get this. Jesus sees Lazarus' story. He sees that he's living in the house of suffering. He sees that he's sick, but Jesus also sees something else. He sees that there's a purpose to this. He sees that Lazarus in life and in death belongs to God, and God is going to use this. God is doing something through this. That Jesus trusts God even in this terrible moment. That even in the house of suffering, it is not meaningless, but God has a purpose in this. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. I love this. I love John just drops this on us. So he loved them, so he stayed. Because he loved them, he made them wait 2 more days. Because he loved them, he waited until Lazarus died. Do you hear this? No comment, no explanation. It's just like John wants to just drop that out there for you to chew on that maybe when God leaves you in your suffering, maybe when God makes you wait, it's not because he's indifferent, not because he's mad at you. Maybe it's because he loves you that he makes you wait. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. That's where Bethany is. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back? Like, Jesus, last time we were there, people wanted to kill you. They did, if you read in chapter 10. It's a bad deal. So Jesus is like, hey, I'm going to die when I'm going to die, and now's not my time. And they go through this little back and forth speech about, Lazarus is sleeping. And he's like, well, if he's asleep, shouldn't we let him wake up naturally so he can get well? And Jesus is like, let's be clear here. Verse 14, so then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. And then Thomas speaks, also known as Didymus, which is just a word means the twin. That was his nickname. And then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. If Jesus is going to go to Galilee and get stoned, we should too. Don't you love Thomas? I love Thomas. Like, we're not one of those churches that has like a patron saint, but if we did, we might be the Church of St. Thomas, right? Right? Because, in this chapter, like, he is full of passionate faith. Like, if Jesus is going to die, I'm going to die too. But then in chapter 20, he's full of equally passionate doubt. Unless I see the nail hands, I won't believe. He's both. Passionate faith, passionate doubt. I don't know, maybe it's just me. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. This is a grieving ritual. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary, literally it says, sat at home, and that word becomes important. So this is 4 days. 4 days have passed, and that's important for that context, because in the ancient Near Eastern context, people believed that the spirit of someone might hover around the body for 1 or 2 days, but by the 3rd day, it got locked out. And then the 4th day, you just got like this rotting corpse there. That's all it is. So he's rotting now when Jesus shows up. And then we notice that all these people have come out from Jerusalem because this is a big part of the Jewish mourning ritual where all these people of Jerusalem, this major city, came up to Bethany. And then they literally sit Shiva is the Jewish ritual, where you sit in these low stools and you go through this mourning ritual where they would wail and weep and such like that. Mary sat at home means she's sitting Shiva, she's mourning. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Have you ever prayed like that? Where were you? But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. You see, Martha, she knows her Bible. She knows Daniel chapter 12, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. She knows Isaiah 26, your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. She knows that in the last day, the end of time, when time as we know it comes to a close, that there will be a great resurrection, and your body that has been, your body and soul that have been torn apart in death will be put back together, and you will stand before God for judgment. She knows her Bible, but she doesn't know exactly who she's talking to. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. To call this extraordinary doesn't quite do it justice. In the book of Exodus, God hears the cries of his people. They're in this place of suffering in Egypt. They're enslaved, persecuted, oppressed. And so he leads them out. He leads them to freedom, to become children of God in what we call the Exodus. And when he does, when he comes to them, when he sets them free from their oppression, from their suffering, from what they're in, he leads them to the wilderness, and then he does something that has never happened before, something unheard of, something that the whole world has never seen a moment like this. He reveals to them his personal name, that you can now call God by his first name, by his personal name. We think it's pronounced something like Yahweh. In our scriptures, it's just translated, I am that I am. Now get this. Here's this peasant from Nazareth, son of a carpenter in the middle of nowhere in this small town, and he just claimed that name for himself. I am. Like, I am the God who hears your cries. I'm the one who meets you in the place of suffering. I am the one who brings body and soul back together. I am the hope that someday all things will be made new. I am the God you will have to stand before in judgment. I am God. Now, I don't know what you personally do with this man who claims to be God, but Jesus seems to think that how you respond to this is really, really important. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me, whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Jesus seems to think that how we respond to this will not only determine our life after death, but will determine what our life looks like before death. That it'll change our life now and forever. And it has something to do with believing, but I think this word, sometimes we get caught in this word. Sometimes this word sounds like you have to intellectual assent to something. And that, there is some truth to that. There are some facts that we probably need to know, that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, rose again 3 days later. But this word means a lot more than like some type of mental exercise or suspending mental exercise here. One scholar, Frederick Bruner, suggested a better translation, and I like this one, is to relax or rest. Stop trying to control it. Stop trying to find the answer on your own. Just relax. Let down. Trust God with this. Will you relax and trust Jesus even in the face of death? Will you trust him with your life? Will you relax? The image is the image of a child who doesn't have all the answers, doesn't have any idea how to solve the problem, but can sleep like a baby. Why? Because they so trust mom and dad. That's the image. Jesus seems to think that if we could just relax, not because we have things under control, but because he does, that this wouldn't just change our life after death, but it would change how we live. And then he asks that question, do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. It's stunning. Then, verse 32, Mary shows up. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Why do we cry? Have you ever thought about this? Like, why do we cry? As far as we can tell, humans seem to be the only animals that actually do this, that actually shed tears under emotional duress. The other night, I heard some bird getting attacked or something in the middle of the night. I woke up and looked out the window. It sounded like, ah! So it was crying out, but it's not the same as crying. Crocodiles famously shed crocodile tears, like saltwater tears. If you scold your dog, it looks sad. Cats, of course, have all the empathy of a psychopath. But as far as we can tell, humans are the only species that shed like real emotional tears from duress. So researchers have actually started to study this, and they found that the composition of emotional duress tears, like tears from like sadness or grief, are actually different than like chopping onion tears. That there's something different. That there's certain toxins that are released. Some have this theory that we're releasing toxins, and there's some like stress relief through the process. I was listening to a podcast with this famous psychologist recently, and I couldn't find the study, but she referenced a study in which they took the emotional duress tears of humans and they fed them to mice, and the mice actually died. Now, I couldn't find the study. I was like, is this true? But all I got to say is that some of us, it's been so long since we cried, we could put down a horse. Yeah. Whatever we do with that, crying does not seem to be primarily about the physiological benefits. It's not about releasing stress so much. It seems to be God created us to cry for others. It's sociological, it's relational, it's communal, that when we shed tears, we communicate more than words. We share our vulnerability, our pain, even our joy, right? You shed tears of joy. We share our inner world. When you cry, you expose your inner world. You expose what's really going on inside. And this is why so many of us, when we start to cry, what do? We cover our faces. Cover our faces. Intentionally or not, crying invites others to enter into your experience. It allows them to feel what we are feeling. Jesus wept. Jesus, the I am, the God of the universe, he enters into your experience, into my suffering, into my loss. He who is joy enters into our sorrow. He who is the presence of God meets us in the house of suffering. He who causes all things allows himself to be affected by us, allows himself to feel what we're feeling. He enters into our anger, our weeping, our suffering. This is breathtaking. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for it has been 4 days." Again, he's just a rotting carcass in there. I love the King James on this. "Lord, he stinketh." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And then he said this, and when he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to him, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." So Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. He gives a brother back to grieving sisters. He reveals that he has the power over the grave. He is the author of life. He is who he says he is. "I am the resurrection and the life." And we could stop right there. That is enough. Jesus has the power over life and death, period. That is the hope of Lazarus. That's the hope of Christianity. That's the hope of Easter. That the same Jesus who called Lazarus out of the grave has promised to call each and every one of us out of the grave. We can rest in this. We can rest in him. But curiously, this is not the end of the story. It's not even the end of the chapter. So we read on in the next section that by going to Bethany, what happened is now the Jewish leaders hear about this, and they are convinced they must now kill Jesus. It's the only way to stop him. That by Jesus going and raising Lazarus from the dead, he set in motion what would cause his own death. That when the Jewish leaders heard what happened, they decided, we must finish this, and we read in verse 53 at the end. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. That the raising of Lazarus inevitably led Jesus to the cross. Look at this. Mary, Martha, the crowds, they had no idea what it would cost for Jesus to enter into Bethany, into the house of suffering, to be with them, to cry with them, to do that there. They had no idea what it would cost him to enter into their suffering, but Jesus, he knew. He knew that coming to Bethany, he knew that grieving with them, he knew that entering into their pain would mean that he has to give up his life on the cross. And he came anyways. And this is where we begin to get a glimpse of the beauty of the gospel. Jesus knew that in order to save you, in order to save me, from our sins, from our brokenness, from our anxieties, our fear, our shame, our doubts, all the things that imprison us internally and externally, that he would have to fully identify with us. He would have to feel what we're feeling. He would have to become like us in every way. And that's what he did on the cross. He fully identified with you. He took upon himself your shame, your brokenness, your pain, your anxiety, your fear, your doubts. On the cross, Jesus feels what you feel. But then the story doesn't end there. He is not just the suffering servant who bears your sins. He is the resurrection and the life. 3 days later, he rose from the dead bodily. He is present, alive here today. Jesus, the resurrected one, then comes after, not people in general, but Mary in her shame, Thomas in his doubts, Peter in his denial, you and your brokenness, you and your anxiety, you and your shame, you and your fear, you and your sin, you and whatever is gripping you. He comes after you to meet you, to look you in the face, to let you cling to him, to let you touch his side, to look at you and say, do you love me? It's personal. The implications are stunning. It suggests that right now, if you open yourself up to Jesus, if you share yourself with him, he can enter into your experience. That Jesus, the bodily resurrected Lord of the universe, feels what you feel. What do you feel right now? Have you ever had someone enter into your deepest brokenness, your hurt, and love you in that moment? I have a couple times in my life. And those moments changed me forever. Jesus wants to enter into your experience so that he can set you free from being trapped in your own inner prison, trapped in what the scriptures call the mind ruled by flesh, the mind that is imprisoned in fear, insecurity, anxiety, shame, sin. That if you let him, he can, in some real measure, feel what you feel and help you make sense of your experience in a way that you could never do on your own. He can, in some way, give you a new heart, a new mind, a new spirit, and someday he'll give you a new body. So what are you saying, Anderson? Are you saying that through a personal relationship with Jesus, I can be transformed by the renewing of my mind? I think so. Are you saying that by just relaxing, letting down my guard, and becoming vulnerable with Jesus, with my deep wound and my fears, my insecurity, my sin, that he can somehow change my neurobiology, the way I think and feel? That he can take my mind that is gripped in anxiety and fear or whatever it's gripped by or caught in this loop, and he can break me out of it, and he can fill my mind with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control? I think so. So I'm a firm believer that no one ever fell in love with Jesus through manipulation or fear. So I'm not going to have our worship team come out and play a song 150 times until you cry. But I thought about it. Yeah. All I'm going to do is say this. You have a choice. We all have a choice every day. Am I going to open myself up to the God who loves me, who's already feels what I feel, or am I going to try and figure it out on my own? I'll leave that to you.